The countries that won the Cold War made a calculation. Heavy industry was expensive, environmentally complicated, and increasingly uncompetitive against lower-cost producers. The sensible answer was to let the market sort it out. Specialize in what you do best. Offshore what you do not. For rare earth processing, that calculation sent almost everything to China. What nobody adequately accounted for was what happens when a single country controls not just the mining, but the entire processing infrastructure for a category of materials that every advanced economy depends on, not as a temporary market condition, not as a transitional phase before diversification catches up, as a durable strategic position built deliberately over 3 decades, and now being used as an instrument of geopolitical leverage. That is what this video is about. Not the materials themselves, but the mechanism. How a supply chain becomes a weapon, how that weapon has already been used, and what the pattern of its use tells us about where this is going. Rare earth elements are not rare in the geological sense. They exist in reasonable concentrations across multiple continents. The problem has never been where they are. The problem is what it takes to turn them into something usable. Processing rare earths is technically demanding, capital-intensive, and generates significant environmental waste. Those characteristics made it unattractive to Western producers operating under strict environmental regulation and short investment horizons. China had different constraints, different time horizons, and a government willing to absorb the costs that market actors would not. By the early 2000s, China was producing roughly 90% of the world's refined rare earth output, not because the geology favored it disproportionately, but because it had systematically outcompeted, underpriced, and eventually replaced alternative processors across the United States, Europe, and Australia. The result was a supply chain with a single dominant node, and a single dominant node in any critical system is a choke point. The question was never whether that choke point would be used. The question was when, against whom, and at what cost to the user. The answer to the first part of that question came in 2010. In September 2010, the Japanese Coast Guard detained a Chinese fishing vessel captain near the Senkaku Islands, a chain of uninhabited outcroppings in the East China Sea that both Japan and China claim as sovereign territory. The diplomatic dispute that followed was not unusual. Territorial friction between the two countries had existed for decades. What happened next was unusual. Within weeks of the detention, rare earth shipments from China to Japan slowed sharply. Beijing never formally acknowledged an embargo. There was no official announcement, no declared policy. Customs processing simply became slower, documentation requirements became more demanding, and the materials stopped flowing at the rate Japanese manufacturers needed. Japan was at the time the largest consumer of rare earth materials for high-end manufacturing. Its electronics sector, its automotive industry, and its defense supply chain all depended on processed rare earths for components that could not be substituted on short notice. The impact was immediate. Prices spiked, production timelines were disrupted, and the message was unmistakable even without being stated explicitly. China did not need to threaten military action to force a change in Japanese behavior. It needed to demonstrate once that it could interrupt the inputs to Japan's industrial economy at will. The fishing captain was released. The territorial dispute returned to its normal state of managed ambiguity. What made this possible was not resource ownership in the conventional sense. Japan did not need the ore in the ground. It needed processed material, finished to the specifications its manufacturing sector required. Because China had concentrated the processing infrastructure so thoroughly over the preceding decades, there was no alternative supplier operating at the necessary scale. The choke point held. This is the mechanism that matters. It is not about who owns the mineral deposit. It is about who controls the transformation of raw material into usable industrial input. That is where the leverage lives, and that is what China had spent 30 years building. If you want the full analytical framework behind how mineral dependencies of this kind get constructed and how they reshape alliance politics and strategic competition, that argument is developed in full in my book, The Elements of Power, which is linked in the description. What I want to focus on here is what the 2010 episode revealed about how Beijing thinks about this instrument, because the 2010 use was not the endpoint. It was the proof of concept. The global response to 2010 was instructive. There was genuine alarm. The United States, Japan, and the European Union all launched initiatives to develop alternative rare earth supply chains. The WTO eventually ruled against China's export restrictions. Several Western mining projects received new investment and political attention. None of it fundamentally changed the processing picture. The capital costs of building rare earth processing facilities from scratch are substantial. The environmental permitting timelines in Western democracies are long. The technical expertise required had largely migrated to China over the preceding decades and was not easily reconstituted. By the mid-2010s, most of the diversification initiatives had stalled, been scaled back, or been abandoned entirely as rare earth prices fell and the urgency dissipated. Beijing watched all of this and drew conclusions. In July 2023, China announced export controls on gallium and germanium, two materials critical to semiconductor manufacturing, solar panels, and military-grade radar and communications systems. This was not a response to a territorial dispute. There was no fishing captain, no specific bilateral provocation. The controls came several months after the United States had imposed sweeping restrictions on the export of advanced semiconductors and chip manufacturing equipment to China. The symmetry was deliberate, but the strategy behind it was longer than the immediate context suggests. The 2023 controls were made possible by the same logic that produced the 2010 episode. China had allowed, and in some cases actively encouraged, the concentration of gallium and germanium processing within its borders. It produced roughly 80% of the world's gallium and 60% of its germanium at the time the controls were announced. When the controls came, the response options available to affected countries were structurally limited for exactly the same reasons they had been limited in 2010. The retaliation against U.S. semiconductor policy was real. But the capacity to retaliate in this specific way was not improvised. It was the product of an industrial strategy that had been running for decades, producing choke points across multiple material categories simultaneously. The 2023 controls were one activation of a capability that had been quietly constructed across gallium, germanium, graphite, and other materials that sit upstream of the technologies both sides are competing over most intensely. This is what distinguishes Beijing's approach from ordinary trade policy or even conventional economic statecraft. The goal was not to maximize export revenue from these materials. The goal was to build a position from which leverage could be applied at a time and in a manner of China's choosing. The export controls in 2023 were not the strategy. They were the strategy becoming visible. The pattern across both episodes points toward a single underlying logic, and it is worth stating it precisely because it is frequently mischaracterized in Western policy discussions. China's rare earth strategy is not about resource nationalism in the conventional sense. It is not primarily about maximizing the value extracted from domestic mineral deposits. It is about controlling the processing layer of critical supply chains in a way that creates structural dependencies in adversary economies, dependencies that are expensive to eliminate, slow to reverse, and whose existence provides leverage that can be activated selectively without triggering the escalation thresholds associated with military action. This is a form of coercive power that operates below the threshold of conflict and above the threshold of ordinary commercial competition. It is not trade policy. It is not industrial policy in the neutral sense. It is the deliberate construction of a strategic instrument using economic and industrial means. Understanding it as such changes what an adequate response looks like. If the problem were simply that China has large rare earth deposits, the solution would be to develop deposits elsewhere. But that is not the problem. The problem is that China controls the processing infrastructure, the technical expertise, and the supply chain relationships that convert raw materials into strategic inputs. Matching that position requires not just mining investment, but the reconstruction of an entire industrial ecosystem that Western economies allowed to atrophy over 30 years. That is a fundamentally different challenge. It requires longer time horizons, sustained political commitment, and a willingness to absorb costs that market actors will not absorb voluntarily. The question of whether Western governments have demonstrated those qualities in their response to this challenge so far is one the evidence answers fairly directly. The 2010 episode produced alarm and then inaction. The 2023 controls produced alarm, and a new round of initiatives whose long-term trajectory remains genuinely uncertain. The execution gap between what governments commit to and what those commitments produce in operational terms is not a new problem. It is a structural one, and it is the subject of the third book in my critical materials series, The Mineral State, for those who want to follow that argument further. What is clear from the arc of both episodes is that Beijing is not improvising. The strategy has internal consistency across a 15-year period. The materials targeted, the timing of the controls, the gap between announcement and operational impact on affected industries all reflect a level of strategic patience and institutional coherence that the Western response has not consistently matched. That asymmetry is the central geopolitical reality this supply chain represents. Not the specific materials, not the specific export controls. The asymmetry between a strategy that has been running for decades and a response that keeps restarting from the beginning every time the immediate pressure dissipates. If the argument in this video raised questions you want to pursue further, the analytical framework behind how mineral dependencies get constructed, how they interact with alliance politics, and how they function as instruments of strategic competition is developed in full across the Critical Materials series. The Elements of Power covers the dependency mechanism in depth. The Mineral State, the most recent book in the series, deals specifically with the institutional question of why the gap between strategic commitment and operational execution persists the way it does. Both are linked in the description. The next video in this series examines how middle powers are navigating this supply chain reality. The states caught between Chinese processing dominance and Western pressure to diversify, and what their strategic choices reveal about how this competition is likely to develop. If that question interests you, the archive is there.